Today's stuff we're going to be learning is Menachot Daf Gimel. Today's stuff is sponsored by Lindsay Simmons in loving memory of her father, Brian Simmons, Baruch ben Eliezer Rachel, and his 8th yahrzeit. The fabulous and adoring Grandpa Brian. We miss his infectious joy every day. Yehi Zichro Baruch. Today's stuff is sponsored by Daniel and Sarah Borelowitz in honor of the marriage of their granddaughter Shirel Harrow to Yonatan Banner. So happy and excited may they be zochet to build a bayit ne'eman b'Yisrael. Okay, we're going to get started. Okay, let's review a little bit what we did yesterday. There's a study guide for today. I'm not going to actually share screen, but you can use it as your guide for the daf. We started, and I put back on the chart the machloket, the contradiction between Rabbi Shimon and the braitot and Rabbi Shimon and the other braitot. If you remember what we started with, we had a Mishnah. Our Mishnah talks about a mincha that's done shelo lishma, with the wrong intent. So when we do it with the wrong intent, according to the Mishnah, the mincha is accepted, or it's kshera, you can continue to bring it, and not only that, we learned yesterday, you have to bring the rest of it in the right manner, but it does not fulfill the obligation of the owner. Came Rabbi Shimon in the braitot and says, not only is it good, but it actually fulfills the obligation. And Rabbi Shimon explained there, and this is going to be a little bit of focus today, Rabbi Shimon in the braitot said, it's because ma'aseha mochichim. What's the difference between a mincha and a zevach? In a zevach, the shechita is the same, everything's the same, so your actions don't show the difference. But according to Rabbi Shimon in a mincha, your actions show. I said marcheshet, which means deep pan, but in the end I brought it in a flat pan. Obviously, my intention was a lie, so to speak. I didn't mean it, and therefore we can ignore it. That's a big chidush, and we're going to talk about this today. So then we said, well, right, does Rabbi Shimon obviously seems to disagree with the Mishnah, to which they said, well, it sort of depends on something else. It depends on how you resolve whether you're Rava, Raba, or Rav Ashi. Sorry, Raba first, then Rava, then Rav Ashi. It depends on how you resolve this contradiction between Rabbi Shimon and himself, because Rabbi Shimon in a different braitot actually said something that seems to match the Mishnah. And then we said, well, if you hold like Rav Ashi, which again, without going into all the details, then you actually could figure out a way to explain Rabbi Shimon with the Mishnah, because you could just say our Mishnah is talking about a different situation than Rabbi Shimon was. But according to Raba and Rava, we showed there's no other way to explain. You can't explain the Mishnah the way we explained that other braitot when we said they had that contradiction with Rabbi Shimon. You can't explain the Mishnah that way because the words just don't match up, in which case, yeah, Rabbi Shimon disagrees with our Mishnah. So what we're going to do today is we're going to see the three opinions inside. We only saw one inside. We saw it somewhat inside, but we didn't see it fully inside yesterday. We're going to see the three opinions, and we're going to ask difficulties on each of them. So we started with Raba already. Remember, Raba said, what's the resolution to the contradiction? Raba said, Kam b'shinoi kodesh, kam b'shinoi bali. If you change the type of mincha you're offering, that is very noticeable, whether you do it in a deep pan or a flat pan. And that fits perfectly with what Rabbi Shimon says. When Rabbi Shimon in the braitot said there are cases where it's not going to work, when's that? When your actions don't indicate that you made a mistake and that you didn't even mean what you said in your thoughts, because it's mashinoi balim. You changed who you're doing the mincha for. Your thought was, instead of doing it for one person, you were doing it for somebody else. Now that's not something noticeable. In the end, your actions are going to be all the same, whether you do it for Ruth or you do it for Naomi, your actions are going to be the same. So therefore, that's not a noticeable situation. And that's how he explained the contradiction. Now let's just think about this for 1 minute, because this is going to be very important. We're going to have altogether 9 difficulties. We started with 1 yesterday. We're going to do the other 8 today. 9 difficulties on Raba, and they're all based on this one main idea. That if it's clear that you didn't intend your action because your thoughts, again, we're going to go with Rashi here, and Rashi says your thoughts are expressed in words. And this is very important, because if you explain that your thoughts are in your head, this doesn't make as much sense. You're going to have to explain the sugya differently. But we're explaining it according to Rashi. It says that when we say machshava, it means you expressed it. Now, you have a Kohen, let's say who's doing a kmitza. He expresses, I'm doing this for a marcheshet. And then he goes ahead and puts it, instead of in the marcheshet, the deep pan, he puts it in a flat pan. Now, it's very clear that when he said, and this is why you have to say he said it, otherwise it doesn't really make sense. And again, you'd have to understand the sugya differently according to the Rambam and the Ritva, who basically think that you actually just thought it in your head. But the point is, ma'aseh mochechim is everyone around can see that you clearly didn't mean marcheshet, because if you meant marcheshet, you would have put it in the deep pan. So we can ignore your machshava. That's what this is based on. So what we're going to do is we're going to bring a slew of questions as we started yesterday of all sorts about, now, what does Rabbi Shimon say? It's only true for mincha, not for anything else. And he specifically says, right, korban is completely different, not the same thing, because it's shchita, right? All the bloods, everything you do is the same. There's no noticeable difference, but it's not true. We're going to go through tons of cases here. Like I said, 9 questions, one we did yesterday, the rest we're going to do today, where actually it would be ma'aseh mochichim. And why there don't we say that Rabbi Shimon disagrees there? You would expect Rabbi Shimon to come in there and say, oh yeah, ma'aseh mochichim, but he says only by mincha. So let's go through our questions. So we're going to start from the bottom of bet, Amud bet at the bottom. Olat ha'of shemitzad dama lamala. So you squeeze out the blood. Now remember, the olat ha'of, and if you don't remember, I'll remind you. The olat ha'of is done at the top of the altar. The chatat's done at the bottom. The ola, you do mitzvah, you squeeze the blood out. The chatat, you do at the bottom and you sprinkle the blood. And only the remainder gets squeezed out. Okay? Now, so one you're standing at the top of the altar, one you're standing at the bottom. So olat ha'of shemitzad dama lamala l'shem chatat ha'of. You do an olat ha'of. You do mitzvah adam. You're squeezing the blood out of the bird right after you do the malika, which is the way you kill the bird in the temple. And you do it l'shem chatat ha'of. Now, you don't do a chatat ha'of at the top, and you don't do mitzvah in a chatat ha'of. So ma'aseh mochim alav aleha da'olat ha'ofi. So why don't we say that would be accepted? Because we can ignore your machshava, because it was clearly not true. Because look, your actions prove that that's not what you're doing. If it was really the chatat ha'of, you would have been standing at the bottom of the altar, and you would have done the sprinkling of the blood. So Amre Dilma Mitzvah de Batar Hazahu da Amramar Mitzad Ama B'Chomakom B'Mizbeach Shera. Maybe we're talking about the mitzvah. I told you a minute ago that in the chatat ha'of, you sprinkle the blood, but when you have the remainder of the blood, you actually squeeze out. Now you do it at the bottom. However, if you're standing at the top of the altar doing mitzvah on a bird, you actually, and you say, I'm doing this for chatat ha'of, there is a way where chatat ha'of, if you were to do, now the mitzvah happens at the second stage. But since you could do the mitzvah at the second stage, and it says that if you mitzad ama b'chol makom b'mizbeach, you can even do it at the top. Even though you're supposed to do it at the bottom, it's kosher if you do it at the top anyway. So therefore, if somebody sees you, you say, I'm doing this for chatat ha'of, and then they see you squeezing the blood out at the top of the altar, since that works for a chatat, therefore, it's not so clear that you were lying about your machshava. And that's why, now, you have to remember, what people are seeing are 2 things. They're seeing stage 2, which is when you actually say your machshava and you express it. And then they see the action you're doing. What they don't know is what you originally intended it for. So even though this happened to have been originally intended as an ola, and then you did it for a chatat, but they don't know that. They don't know what way back when you designated the animal for. All they see is you saying, I'm doing this for, right? They see the Kohen doing the malika saying, I'm doing this for the sake of a chatat. And then they see him squeeze the blood out. So they could still think it's all a chatat. And then ma'aseh are mochichim, and that's why it's disqualified, because it wasn't. It happened to be an ola. Just nobody knows that. Okay, third question. Okay, it's our second for today, but third question. Chatat ha'of. Okay, we're still in the birds. So now you have a sin offering, as opposed to the other cases we said was a bird burnt offering. Now we're doing the bird sin offering. Where's it supposed to go? At the bottom. What are you supposed to do? Sprinkle the blood. So what if hizad dama lamata? You sprinkle the blood down at the bottom. L'shem olat ha'of. But you say, I'm doing this for the purposes of an ola. Now olat ha'of doesn't get done at the bottom, and it doesn't get sprinkled. So that's pretty clear that your machshava meant nothing. So why don't we say that's accepted, right? Tiratzeh, it should be accepted. Right? It's very clear that you didn't mean anything when you said, I'm doing this for the sake of an olat of, because you're clearly not. Because you're doing it at the bottom, which doesn't work for an ola, and you're sprinkling the blood, which doesn't work for an ola either. You would have done it at the top, and you would have done mitzvah. So why wouldn't this be accepted according to Rabbi Shimon? To which, surprisingly, the Gemara is going to say, Hachinami. Actually, Rabbi Shimon would agree. Okay, most of the questions we're going to answer, no, it's not the same. But, or no, the Masim don't prove it. Okay, that's so far how he answered. But when we get to a point, which is going to happen twice, where we can't answer that, we're going to say, oh, in fact, Rabbi Shimon must agree in this case. In other words, even though in the Mishnah he said mincha only, anything that's like a mincha, the maaseh mochichim, which we did find a case, right? It actually would work. So hachanami, according to Rabbi Shimon, if you did a chatat of down at the bottom, sprinkle the blood, and said, I'm doing this for the ola, we're going to ignore your thought. We're going to say it's kosher. Because, right, and not only is it kshera, but it works for the owner, right, and it's yatsa yidei chova. He fulfilled this obligation. Because we just ignore your thought, because it was obviously wrong. Ella, what's the problem? Didn't the Mishnah say, though, the braitot of Rabbi Shimon, she'ein ha-menachot domot l'zvachim kamar? He said, but this is a unique halacha by a mincha, not true for other korbanot, right? For sacrifices that have blood and all that, because it's all shchita is the same, the zrika is the same, right? All that. So they say, l'zvachim v'lo la'ofot. Well, zevach usually means animal sacrifice, not bird sacrifice. So we can say that there are cases also by birds where Rabbi Shimon agrees. Okay, now we're moving away from birds. Those were our slew of questions about birds. Now we're moving to animals. Koche kochim, sheshachatam b'tzafon l'shem kochim kalim. Let's remember our laws. Okay, kochim kalim, like shlamim and things that the owners eat, that gets slaughtered anywhere in the courtyard. But koche kochim, the higher sanctity offerings, get sacrificed. It must be slaughtered in, right? I hope I said slaughtered, not sacrifice. Slaughtered. We're talking about only the slaughtering. The slaughtering has to happen in the northern part of the courtyard for koche kochim, like chatat asham ola. So, and shlamei tzibur, okay, unique ones. But anyway, without getting into that right now. So, koche kochim, I took koche kochim, and I slaughtered them in the tzafon, but I said I'm doing it l'shem kochim kalim, which could be done in the darom, right? So I'm in the north, and I'm doing it, and I say I'm doing it, right now. Nobody knows what was designated, but we know it was designated as koche kochim. But anyone standing there sees the person sacrificing in the north. They say north. The person said kochim kalim, but he must have not meant that because we don't do kochim kalim in the north. Now you might say, we do, hold off. It's true, we do. But let's ignore that right now. Right now they kind of view it as, oh, well, since you don't have to do kochim kochim in the kochim kalim, in the north, presumably they do them in the south. Okay, that seems to be the assumption here. So if we see someone doing kochim kochim and he does them, now, somebody knows that it was koche kochim. If we see him slaughtering it in the north, but says I'm doing it for kochim kalim, wouldn't we say maaseh mochichim that he didn't do it shelo lishma because he didn't really mean the kochim kalim because he's in the north? To eat kochim kalim, but if it was really kochim kalim, he would have done it in the south. So they say, no, that's not a good question because of what I mentioned, which is imur da'amar rachmanim, when the Torah said you have to do koche kochim in the north and koche kalim doesn't mean they can't be done in the north. It means af b'darom. It doesn't mean kochim kalim have to be done in the south, just like koche kochim have to be done in the north. It just meant they can also be done in the south. You could really do them anywhere in the courtyard, north or south. B'darom v'lo b'tzafon mi'amar. It didn't say in the south and not the north. So therefore, you could do kochim. You could slaughter kochim kalim in the north also, which means that doesn't look like a lie. Okay. Ditnan, how do we know this? Because it says in the Mishnah, Shchitatam b'chol makom azara. When it talks about kochim kalim and ezim makom shel zvachim, where do you do it? Right? It said anywhere you want in the azara. However, this is going to be more of a problem. What if you flip the case? Kochim kalim sheshachatam b'darom. Let's say you have kochim kalim, like shlamim, which you're supposed to, you can slaughter in the south, and you slaughter it in the south. And as you're slaughtering in the south, you say, l'shem koche kochim. I'm doing this for koche kochim. Liratzu, this should work because right? It's obvious. The fact that you're slaughtering it in the south is very obvious. You didn't really mean koche kochim, right? Let's say you said I'm doing it for a chatat. You obviously didn't mean chatat because you're slaughtering it in the south. To eat koche kochim, b'tzfon hava avid lihu. If it was koche kochim, you would have done it in the north. To which the Gemara says, "What do you mean? We're worried. What's our whole thing? Ma'aseh mochichim alehem. It's that bystanders will see and think, right? They'll see. They don't know, like we said before, they don't know what you designated it as originally. They'll see you doing something. So in this case, they see you slaughtering in the south. They see you say, I'm doing this for koche kochim. They know that's a lie. And then in the end, we find out, right, this was kochim kalim, and you did it as you do kochim kalim. You had a messed up machshava, but it doesn't ruin your korban because right? Because we ignore your machshava, and it should be fine. Now, this is not true. We don't say this. We only say it by menachot. But this would be a classic case where we'd say, your machshava obviously was not true, and it's very clear to everyone standing there. To which they say, no, wait a minute. What's a bystander going to say? So a bystander could say that, could think, oh yeah, this person really didn't mean it was koche kochim, because if it was koche kochim, he would have been just slaughtering it in the north. But Amre, koche kochim, he could also say, they are koche kochim maybe, because again, he has no idea, the bystander, what it was originally designated for. So he sees this person slaughtering in the south side of the temple. Say, I'm doing this for koche kochim. Theoretically, it could be me'aver da'aver v'shachatu b'darom. Could be really it was koche kochim. It was a korban chatat from the beginning. It was an animal designated for korban chatat. The person says I'm slaughtering for korban chatat, and they're just doing an averah. They're doing something wrong. They're doing it the wrong place in the azarah. People make mistakes all the time, or people intentionally do. Maybe it was busy on the north side. The person had no patience. They said, I'll just do it on the south. There's no space there. I'm just going to slaughter it right here. I want to get moving. So it could be they're transgressing something. Okay. This leads the Gemara into a big problem, because if you say, what was our whole thing based on Maaseh Mochichim? I take a machvat one, and I say, right, I'm doing it l'shem marcheshet, and then I put it in a machvat. So what do we say? My actions prove that this clearly was a machvat to begin with, right? Anyone who sees knows I was just lying, because look, I put in a machvat. But why don't we say the same thing? Ihachi, if there's two possibilities, you could say either that was clearly what I meant, or maybe I'm transgressing. Maybe I'm just doing it wrong. You could say, Ihachi machvat l'shem marcheshet nami. You could say the same thing with the machvat l'shem marcheshet. You could say, Hai dika kamitz leila marcheshet. When the Kohen did the kmitza, he said, okay, I'm taking this handful for marcheshet. Now again, the bystander has no idea. Was it really machvat or was it really marcheshet? They don't know. What happens at the stage, right? There's three stages. There's the stage you designated. There's the stage that the Kohen does the kmitza and thinks, and says this thought. And then there's the final stage of the action, what they do with it after that. So if you say, right, that the bystander could look and say, right, until now we thought, okay, the bystander's going to say, oh, Kohen clearly was just lying when he said marcheshet, because obviously he did a machvat. Another minute later, it was clear it was a machvat. Now they say, what do you mean? It could be, the person could say, Amar, hai b'marcheshet nadal. Maybe it really was a marcheshet at stage one. Maybe this mincha was brought from the beginning for a marcheshet, and then the Kohen said it's for marcheshet. And then why did he bring it in machvat in the end? Maybe the marcheshet Maybe the Kohen is just doing something wrong. Happens. Kohanim make mistakes or intentionally or unintentionally. And just decide, like I said, it either could be just a mistake, or maybe there were no marcheshets around. The Kohen didn't want to wait in line, just stuck it in a machvat against the law. In which case, how can we say this is a valid offering? Okay, that's the big question. And that's if in the end, right, we tried to say this is a question because why don't we say the kochim kalim that were then done l'shem koche kochim and done in the south aren't the same as the mincha? Now we're going to say, no, that's because people could say maybe he did something wrong. Well, if that's the case, then we should say the same thing with the mincha. And then this halacha of Rabbi Shimon makes no sense. So now they're going to say, no, it's different when it comes to a mincha. Why? We're not going to say the person did an avera, and that's because, when they asked this question, okay, they didn't know there's a Mishnah at the end of our Masechet, and Daf Kuf Bet. What does that Mishnah say? Well, Hatam ki, first they're going to explain it, and then they're going to show it in the Mishnah. Hatam ki nami b'marcheshet nadal, ki maitele b'machvat machvat havya. Let's take a case where I really did it as a marcheshet, which is what we're suggesting maybe people will see. People will see the Kohen doing the kmitza, saying marcheshet. Maybe they'll think it was originally a marcheshet. Let's say it was originally a marcheshet. No. What we tried to run this parallel to koche kochim was to say koche kochim you do in the south is clearly disqualified, right? And that's why you could say maybe someone transgressed. But in the case of a mincha and a marcheshet, that wouldn't be the case. It wouldn't be considered a transgression. Why not? Well, the Mishnah says, okay, so that's what we're going to say. If I take a marcheshet and I bring it as a machvat, okay, so I designate a meal offering. I said I'm bringing it as a minchat marcheshet in a deep pan, And then in the end, I bring it in this flat, regular frying pan. Okay, this is like deep frying versus regular frying. So I bring it in a regular frying pan. Guess what? When I do that, it becomes a machvat. If I take koche kochim or kochim kalim and I do them as koche kochim, or in this case it was koche kochim. I do them as kochim kalim. I can't do that. I can't change the nature of a korban. But a mincha, if I say I'm doing a marcheshet, and then I actually put in a machvat, it actually becomes a machvat. So you can't say, I sinned, I did something wrong to Kohen when he stuck it in the machvat. It's not wrong. It actually becomes a machvat. Let's read what actually happens here. Kiditzna, like it says in the Mishnah. Haomer, now you have to get the case here. We talked about the difference between a neder and nidava yesterday. This is going to become important. A neder is I'm going to bring something, and a nidava is this is going to be brought. Okay? And remember, the difference is achrayut. What if something happens to it? Well, then you have to replace it. In the first case, because I said I'm going to bring something, so if something happens to it, I have to replace it, right? The second case, I said this. If something happens to that, well, it doesn't matter. So let's see the cases. Haomer harei alai b'machvat. I have to bring a machvat. Right? I'm committing to bring a machvat in a flat frying pan. Vehevi b'marcheshet. And then I brought in marcheshet, or the reverse, which is actually our case. B'marcheshet, ve'evi b'machvat. So I said I'm going to bring it in a marcheshet, and in the end I bring a machvat. Mashe evi. So actually, what happens? Well, I said I'm going to bring a marcheshet. Did I bring a marcheshet? No. So, yedei nidro lo yatsa. I didn't fulfill my neder, but I actually brought a meal offering that was put in a machvat. I brought a meal offering. I brought a machvat one, so I still have to bring a marcheshet one, but it's not like I said it was, right? I brought koche kochim and sacrificed them as kochim kalim, or the reverse, right? That's different. That's doing something wrong. I took a koche kochim and I sacrificed them as kochim kalim. That's mamash wrong, or I slaughtered them in the south. Okay? That doesn't work. I can't do that. But I could take a marcheshet and change it into a machvat. In this case where I said, I'm going to bring a marcheshet, I bring the meal offering, and then I just happen to bring it as a machvat. So again, I've brought a meal offering, valid. Right? Our case with the koche kochim was disqualified because I did it in the south. So we could say I didn't have avera. Can't say I didn't have avera here, which means that, now let's think of our case. The Kohen, now again, it's all about what people think when they see me doing it. It actually happens, it was a machvat, okay? But when people see the Kohen saying, this is l'shem marcheshet, and then bringing it as a machvat, they could say, oh, maybe it was a case where the person said they were bringing a marcheshet, the Kohen said marcheshet, but then he switched it to be a machvat. Now, in that case, the person still has to bring another korban, but there's nothing wrong with what happened. That was actually brought as a machvat, and it's a kosher korban. So you can't say, oh, it was a sin, right? So in that case, the Kohen's machshava of marcheshet was wrong, because in the end, the Kohen brought it as a machvat. This wasn't a marcheshet korban. Okay, even though the person originally said, I'm going to bring a marcheshet korban, but the fact the Kohen said marcheshet, we again could say that was just a lie, because in the end, he brought it as a machvat. So that basically explains, Rabbi Shimon, why this is different from the other case. But that's ignoring the second part of the Mishnah, because the Gemara now says, Vidilma Amar Zo, right? It said there's difference between Harei Alai, I'm going to bring, Harei Zo. But what about the case where the person said, this meal offering will be a marcheshet? Now, in that case, obviously the halacha is going to be different, because then if you bring it as a machvat, you've done the wrong thing. If I say, I'm going to bring, and then I happen to bring a different one, so we just say, okay, well, that wasn't what you promised you were going to bring, so you still have to bring what you said, but that one could work as, okay, you must have just decided to do a new one, right? But Dilma Amar Zo, Lavi b'machvat, ve'vi b'marcheshet, this is going to be brought in the machvat, and he brought in the marcheshet, or the reverse. Kiditnan, as it says in that Mishnah there, Zo lahavi b'machvat, ve'vi b'marcheshet, marcheshet, ve'vi b'machvat, arezo psula. That's actually disqualified. So now you could say that according to Rabbi Shimon, now we have a serious question. According to Rabbi Shimon, that should be accepted. Because in the end, ma'aseha mochichim. In other words, if it was a case of Zo, I just said that wrong. According to that, that should be similar to the case where if I said Zo, and here Rabbi Shimon doesn't differentiate with a mincha of a machvat brought as, with the thought of a marcheshet. If it was a case of Zo, it would be exactly like the koche kochim example, where in the end it'll be disqualified. If it was designated for Marcheshet and I brought it as a Machvat, it's completely disqualified. So why can't people say, oh, maybe the Kohen wasn't lying when he said Marcheshet, maybe it really was a Marcheshet, because they have no idea what it was. It really was a Machvat, but nobody knows. They see it, they say, oh, maybe that was really a Marcheshet and the Kohen just made a mistake and brought it as a Machvat, or on purpose, whatever reason. He sinned. It was wrong. And then we can't just ignore his machshava. Maybe that really was a marcheshet, and maybe this really should be disqualified. So how could Rabbi Shimon say that it's not? So now that they have this question, they answer in the following way. Le Rabbanan hachinami. Now, what they're pointing out here, the Rabbanan they're talking about here is in the Mishnah in Menachot. And they basically say, you're right. The Mishnah further on that we just quoted, first of all, just know it's only the rabbi's position. It's not Rabbi Shimon's position. You're asking a question on Rabbi Shimon from the position of the rabbis. If you took the position of the rabbis, you're right. We have a difficulty on Rabbi Shimon. Because really people might look and say, oh yeah, the Kohen just made a mistake. Because maybe it was a case of Zoh. In other words, you have to remember, all they're seeing is the Kohen bringing this. They have no idea what the person promised originally. If they said Arei Alai, it wouldn't be a problem. If they said Arei Zoh, it would be. But it's all a matter of bystanders watching and what they're going to think. They could think that this Kohen just did it wrong, and then the machshava still stands, and then it would be a problem. So that's all only if you hold by the rabbi's position there in the Mishnah. But the Gemara actually there, the Gemara brings it. It's not in the Mishnah, but the Gemara brings Rabbi Shimon. And the Rabbi Shimon, Kevan Damar Rabbi Shimon, Af Yedei Nidur Yatsa. But Rabbi Shimon has a unique position there. He says, it doesn't matter Zoh, it doesn't matter Alai. You said Marcheshet, or it was also already designated as marcheshet. You bring it as machvat, it totally works. The reverse, it totally works. Whether you said Zoh, whether you said Alai, he says amak v'yuta demana v'lo klumhu. Rabbi Shimon now basically says, and this is going to fit in very well, which kli you put it in makes no difference. Until now, we thought there was a big difference between a marcheshet and a machvat. Now we're going to learn. I could say I'm going to bring it in a deep pan. In the end, if I bring it in a flat pan, it's all fine. Because it's all very similar. It's all a voluntary mincha offering, and I just did it this way instead of that way. Lo shna amar zo, lo shna amar alai. Okay? And therefore, we don't have a question here. Because in the end, this is not the same, okay, what were we trying to compare it to? Kodshem that you slaughtered in the south, which is completely disqualified. This is not only is it not a problem, it's totally fine. You could say marcheshet and bring machvat, ideally, if you want. It makes no difference what kli you put it in. So that's, now again, you have to switch a little. We didn't know that before. Raba has to add this to kind of answer the question against him. Okay, next question. That was the hardest question. Okay, now it's a little simpler. What if you have a korban ola that you slaughter for the sake of a chata? That should work. Why? Now we're going to get to all different cases where, what are we going to say? Again, we're keeping to try proving that if your actions, what you do, proves what you're doing, and basically against your machshava, then we should ignore your machshava, according to the way Raba explained Rabbi Shimon. So we're now going to talk about all differences in the animals you bring. An ola is always a male animal, and a chatat is always a female animal. So if you take a male animal and you slaughter it and say, I'm doing it for chatat, since chatats are not brought from female animals, it should work. Okay, one's a male, one's a female. You're taking a male animal. Is that not proof that you're bringing an ola, not a chatat? Well, not 100%, because you might remember this. We've had discussions like this before. Well, there is one chatat, which is if the nasi, the king, sins, he brings a goat, a male goat. So because of that, they might not realize. Okay, and then it's again not a case of maseh mochichim, and that's why it wouldn't work. Well, then now they say, okay, what if you said amar l'shem chatat yachid? What if you were bringing this ola? The Kohen says, I'm doing this for the sake of individuals, not the kings. And individual sin offerings are always female. So ma'ik l'meimer. And furthermore, for two, and all the more so, chatat yachid, let's take the flip case. If I took an individual sin offering, this is the flip. I started with a sin offering, which is female. I slaughtered it, shachata l'shem ola. I said, I'm doing this, I'm slaughtering it for the sake of an ola. Tiratzeh, it should work. Because I'm taking now a female animal, and I'm saying it's an ola, which of course it can't be. So, what do they answer? Classic answer, mechasi ba'alia. Okay, wait. The sheep has a very fatty tail. and that covers the genital area, so people don't know the difference whether it's male or female because it's covered. Okay, they say, fine, that works if you're talking about a sheep, because the sheep has the fatty tail. ITC, Rama, remember, what if it's a goat, which has very thin tail, and you can see the genitals? People just don't pay attention. People don't look and say, right? They're going to see an animal. They're not going to say, oh, was it a female or a male? Was it that? They're just going to see an animal that you did for the sake of an ola or a chata, whatever it is, and they're going to not pay attention to whether it was male or female, and therefore, again, we're back to, okay, it's not clear from your actions what you're doing. It's very interesting. Clear is always in the eyes of the bystanders. That's what we're looking for here. Pesach sheshakato shelo l'shem asham liratze. Okay, another case. A Pesach you slaughtered for an asham. Again, difference in the animal. Why? Well, they're actually the same animal, same family, sheep family, but the asham is brought from a ram, which is a 2-year-old sheep, and the Pesach is brought from a 1-year-old sheep. Once it's 2 years, you can't bring it. So the high ben shana, high ben shtayim. One is 1 year, one is 2 year. People should be able to tell the difference. So they say, well, kevan icha asham nazir v'asham atzara. You said you're doing it for an asham. You didn't say which asham. Most ashams are brought 2 years, but there are some that are brought 1 year, and that's why, like the asham nazir and the asham atzara, and therefore lo psikale. It's not so clear which one you meant. Okay, what if you said amar l'shum asham gzeilo u'l'shum asham meilo? You said I'm doing it for the asham that actually is a 2-year-old. Ma'i kalamemer, how you can explain, and furthermore, just like we did before, asham gzeilo v'asham meilo, we did the same thing. We flipped the case. What if you take an asham where it's an asham meilo or an asham gzeilo, which has to be a 2-year, and you do it l'shem pesach, okay, which is a 1 year? So in that case, for sure, you'd have a question. You might remember we had this before this sugya. Ella, not in this context, but in a different context. People don't know the difference between a 1-year-old and a 2-year-old, and why is that? We all see people that can't exactly tell their age, right? Sometimes a 1-year-old could look like a 2-year-old, 2-year-old could look like a 1-year-old. Same with animals. People don't see that difference. Okay. Now, what about the fact that but if you take a seir, which is a goat, and you slaughter it for the sake of an asham, which has to be from a ram, that's a different type of animal. That's noticeable. The height semer of se'ar. This one has white wool, the sheep, and the goat has black hair. So they say, you might say, oh wait, maybe it's just a black sheep, right? There are black sheep, so they might not tell the difference. Okay, last question, and this one we're going to answer just like we answered the last question in the slew of the birds. We're actually going to have an exception. Now, okay, we can see people can confuse goats and sheep and male and female animals, but, right, male and females of the sheep and goat family. What if you take a bull or a calf, okay, and you slaughter it for the Pesach, which has to come from the sheep family? Okay, even myself, who, I'm not the best animal person, I don't know all the differences, but I can tell the difference between, okay, an egel and a par, an ox and a calf and a bull. I can tell the difference between that and a sheep or a goat. Okay, liratzu, so it should work. To egel b'par b'pesach v'asham leika. There's no such thing as using cattle for the Pesach and the Asham. To which the Gemara says, inach hinami, and we move to Amud Bet. Yeah, you could say that in fact. In fact, Rabbi Shimon would agree there. Ma'aseh mochichim. What's the big problem? Remember what he said in the braitot? Ma'aseh mochichim in a mincha, not in a zevach. With the bird, we said, okay, zevach is animal, not bird. Can't say that here. Umay zvachim, rov zvachim. He means most sacrifices. There is an exception to the rule. So we found an exception to the rule with the birds, and we found an exception to the rule with the animals. So now we learn that according to Raba, you have to say that Rabbi Shimon has some exceptions to the rule. So Raba works very well because, okay, it didn't work well because we had a slew of questions on him. And it didn't work well because in the end we found some exceptions to the rule. But it did work well with one area that Rava and Rav Ashi are not going to work well in. And that is, he explains it literally what Rabbi Shimon says. Your actions show what you mean. Okay? Very clear. But now we're going to see that both Rava and Rav Ashi don't really fit that pattern. They're going to have to explain those words in a different manner. And you'll see why in a minute. Rava amar lo kashya. Kan bekometz mincha l'shum mincha. Kan bekometz mincha l'shum zevach. It's all a matter of what kind of lo lishma thought you had. If you take a mincha and you say, I'm doing this for a mincha, so that's going to work. If you do it for a sacrifice, that's not going to work. Okay, meaning it'll be kasher. You say, I'm kometz this mincha for a korban ola. Okay, which is a ridiculous thing to say. It's kind of weird that he says this, but okay, that's what he's going to say. Now, why does it work? Mincha l'shum mincha works completely. That's the shita of Rabbi Shimon, that it completely fulfills the obligation. Why? V'zot Torah mincha. Now Rava somewhat addressed this in the middle, and he said, well, all minchas really, it doesn't matter how you do them. This is kind of similar. He says, except that he says, this is the basis of Rabbi Shimon. Zot Torah mincha, Torah l'chol menachot. Okay, all the minchas really are part of one category. Why? Because it's stretched on the pasuk. Zot Torah mincha. Meaning, right, we've seen this before where it says Zot Torah something. Oh, it's the same for all things. We actually ended Zvachim with it. Zot Torah zevach hashlamim, right? That they're all the same for Bama Gdola, Bama Ktana, at least where it relates to Zman. So, same thing here. It's one rule for all the Menachot. So therefore, if you do a mincha, l'shem mincha, what's the difference? It doesn't matter. It doesn't ruin it because it actually is the right thing. Mincha l'shum zevach, well, it never says v'zot Torah to mincha v'zevach lo ktiv. Okay, there's no such pasuk that says this is the Torah for the mincha and the zevach, as if the mincha and the zevach is all one and the same. So, because it doesn't say that, well, can't. Then that one, now again, what's the ruling there? That's the second braitot of Rabbi Shimon. It does work as a mincha, but it doesn't fulfill your obligation. Now, what's the problem with this? This has nothing to do with what Rabbi Shimon said. What did Rabbi Shimon say? Ma'aseh mochichim aleha, that you did it l'shem machvad and not mercheshet. It completely doesn't fit in here. But Rabbi Shimon said it's because your actions prove that you really meant machvad and you didn't mean mercheshet. That's not what he says. What he says here is all the minchas all of the same rule. So he has to completely read Rabbi Shimon differently. And that line there doesn't mean what we think it means. Okay? How so? Hachi kamar. This is how you should read Rabbi Shimon. And we're going to do the same thing with Rav Ashi with a minor difference. You know, each one's going to adapt it to their shita. But the beginning starts off the same. Afal gav de machshava de lo minkarahi v'tifsal. Now, before we even read this inside, what would you think is more of a disqualified thought? One that's partially true or one that's completely false? You would think, from what we learned in Zvachim, that machshava is serious and we take it seriously and it ruins, if your intent is wrong, it ruins a korban. You would much more likely say that if you did what we called before a machshavat sheker, that we say, oh, we just ignore it. That was the way Raba explained it, right? Because it's just such a lie that we know you didn't mean what you said. You could say the exact opposite. The worse your machshava is, the farther away it is from what you said, it actually makes it much worse. So we're going to say like this. Okay, I'll read it inside. Even though, afagav, even though machshava de lo minkara, machshava that's not the right machshava, like saying you're going to bring a marcheshet when you really brought a machvat, and it's very noticeable. In other words, this is a noticeable difference because you said marcheshet, everybody sees that your machshava was wrong because you did it in a machvat. If everyone can see it, v'ti pasil, it should be disqualified. Much worse, much more so. And yet, because remember, what does Rava say? The whole thing is based on v'zot Torah mincha. Now, Rabbi Shimon never says this, so he's adding words. But in the end, v'zot Torah mincha, Torah l'chol menachot, it still doesn't matter. In other words, you would have thought, and that's the whole Maseh Mochim, you would have thought it's worse because everyone can see you just lied. But actually, it doesn't really matter because zot Torah mincha. And my aval b'zvachim eno can say, how's he going to explain? But with zvachim, it's actually better, right? It's actually worse, or whatever. It's different, completely different. So now they're going to say, well, how do you explain that? Afal gav, and then he said, well, I shchita chad kulam. It's all the same. So now he's going to take that same logic we said a minute ago. In zvachim, even though shchita chad kulam, and theoretically, it's going to look the same to bystanders. They're not going to realize that you did it for the wrong korban because you're doing the same action anyway. And it would be more likely you wouldn't disqualify it. But since in the end there's no pasuk there that brings all the zvachim together, zot Torah mincha v'zevach lo ktiv. Okay? It doesn't say, now remember, this is why if you do a mincha l'shem zevach, it's not going to work because there's no pasuk that says mincha l'shem zevach. And also it's not true for, right? So even though you would have thought that in zvachim, it's less of an issue. There's no pasuk that combines all zvachim. So because of that, it's completely disqualified. Right? Therefore, you're not going to fulfill your obligation. So you're actually going to fulfill your obligation with a mincha, not because ma'aseh mochichim. That would have actually led us to the opposite conclusion. But the pullback the other way is this pasuk v'zot Torah mincha. Okay, so now we're going to ask a question. So that was a difficulty on Rava from the language of the Mishnah, of the braitot of Rabbi Shimon. We resolved it because we reread Rabbi Shimon completely. Now, and he still says the same thing, but the words ma'aseh mochichim mean something completely different. So now the Gemara says, okay, Let's see how seriously you take this word, v'zot Torah mincha. If you say zot Torah mincha means all minchas are the same, we're going to do the same thing, v'zot Torah chatat. And here comes our question on Rava. We have one question on Rava, and the same structure is going to be on Rav Ashi. Ela me'ata chatat chelev sheshachata l'shem chatatam l'shum chatat avodah zarah l'shum chatat nazir shum chatat mitzvah. You take a chatat because you ate chelev by accident. Yeah, you bring a chatat. Now, when the Kohen does it, he brings it as a chatat, as if you ate blood, or as if you worshipped avodah zarah by accident, or as if you were a mitzvah or a nazir, and says the wrong sin offering. It should be take sheira v'tiratzed. Amar Rachman zot Torah chatat. There's a parallel pasuk in chatat. It should be the same thing. All chataot. It doesn't matter what you said. You bring them all anyway. Torah achad l'chol chataot. To which they answer, just like we answered some of the questions on Raba, you're right. Le Rabbi Shimon hachinami. Rabbi Shimon would actually accept this. And even the rabbis who disagree with Rabbi Shimon in the mincha would accept it here partially. Le Rabbanan ha'ama Rava, because Rava said somewhere else, chatat chelev sheshachata l'shem chatadam l'shum chatat avodah zarah kshera l'shem chatat nazir l'shem chatat mitzvah psula dahane olo pahadayuninu. Even the rabbis say there's two tracks. If you do a chatat chelev and say I'm doing it for a chatat dam, those are very similar. They're the same kind of chatat. It's just for a different particular sin, but it's the same type of chatat offering. So that actually will work because of zot Torah chatat. Even the rabbis agree with that in this case. He just doesn't allow a crossover between nazir asham and chatat chelev because those are different chataot, and that's because either it depends on your girsa, either it's because the asham nazir and the asham mitzorah are the chatat nazir and mitzorah are brought with other korbanot, like other olot, or because maybe we classify them more similar to olot and chataot. Why? Because they don't come for a sin. Now, there's chatats that come for a sin, and there's chatats that don't come for a sin, and those are unique and a little bit different. Okay, but anyway, even the rabbis agree with that. They just bring a third opinion here about the chatat. This is really not connected to our case. He actually says all the chatats that you do for the sake of a different chatat are psulim, and it still doesn't contradict Rava with zot Torah chatat because there's a different pasuk that teaches you that. In other words, theoretically, zot Torah chatat could have been understood like zot Torah mincha. However, v'shachat ota lechatat l'shem oto chatat, because in the chatat psukim it says you have to slaughter it for a sin offering. It means it has to be specifically for that sin with all the intent across the board. And then we can ignore the zot Torah chatat. It doesn't bother us because there's just some other drasha that tells you can't. Now moving to Rav Ashi. Rav Ashi, if you remember, he differentiates between you're talking about the vessel or you're talking about the mincha. Okay? Lo kasha. Kam bekometz machvat l'shum marcheshet. Kam bekometz mincha machvat l'shum mincha marcheshet. One time you said, I'm bringing it in a flat pan, and then you brought it in a deep pan, or the reverse. You were just talking about the pan you were using it in. The other one, you said, I'm bringing a mincha to be a mincha of a deep pan, or a mincha of a flat pan. Okay? That's completely different. Then you're basically doing a shalol lishma, and we're going to say it doesn't work for the owner. But it does fulfill the obligation if you were just talking about the pan. Why? Your thought just had to do with a pan. You were just talking about a pan. You weren't talking about a sanctified, a mincha, an offering. About I'm bringing this pan, I'm bringing that pan, doesn't disqualify. If you said, I'm doing a mincha machvat, and then it turns out you were doing a mincha marcheshet, or the reverse, you were talking about the mincha, you disqualified, it's a disqualifying thought. So now they say, and that was the one that worked, we could say, our Mishnah matches that too, because our Mishnah could have been talking about, right, that case. But again, this has nothing to do with Maaseh HaMochichim. To which they answer, right, it just has to do with, did you say pan or did you say mincha? That's not what Rabbi Shimon said when he explained his opinion. So again, weakness of this approach. Okay, hachi kamra. You could say it like this. Again, you might have thought this is a machshava that's not right, that if your intent is very clear that was the wrong intent, it would all the more so disqualify it. And yet, it doesn't because you didn't actually say mincha. Okay? And you just had a thought about a vessel, which is totally irrelevant. Umay aval b'zvachim eno ken. So why does it say them but b'zvachim, right? There's no vessels in zvachim, like what are we talking about? Well, af agav d'shchita chad l'kulam, m'zrika chad l'kulam, kabbalah chad l'kulam, b'zvicha d'pasale machshava kamachashev. When it comes to a korban, even though it doesn't look so bad to the bystander, right? But in the end, right, we're going to say, since you're talking about a zevach, there's no such thing as saying the vessel, right? This vessel, that vessel. In a korban, you're either saying ola, shlamim, chatat, right? It's clear you're talking about the korban. So even though theoretically you'd say it looks less worse that your machshava is posel because no one even notices that it's the wrong because they have no idea, but since you said the korban, it was the wrong korban, it doesn't matter what it looks like. Okay? So that's how he explains it. Now we're going to have one difficulty on him. Amar le Rav Ashi. Chareva l'shum belula, amai amar Rabbi Shimon. But then look at the case of chareva l'shum belula. Why did Rabbi Shimon say that works? Amar le, right? Because that's not talking about vessels. The whole thing was if you're talking about a vessel, but chareva l'shum belula are types of minchas. Is it chareva? Is it without the oil or is it with the oil? So amar le l'shum bila ba'alma. No, we're just saying I'm mixing it. Again, it's not the vessel, but you're just talking about the mixing. I'm doing it with oil, I'm doing it without oil. You didn't say mincha in there, so that kind of works. Now remember, Rav Ashi de Rava asked this difficulty. We answered it, but he does ask a difficulty. So now they say a follow-up question then. Ihachi l'shum shlamim nami, l'shum shlamim ba'alma. Shlamim might be the name of a korban, but it's also the name of, in the sake of peace, in the name of peace, I can say I'm bringing it. Not actually a peace offering. So why don't we say, just like belila could mean I'm just mixing it, not necessarily an offering that needs to be mixed. Shlamim the same. So they say, no. You can't compare the word belula to the word shlamim. Why? Hachi hashta. You can't compare them. Hatam zevach gufa yikre shlamim. In the Torah all over, they say shlamim without saying korban shlamim or zevach shlamim. Like here, dichtiv, hamakrivet dam hashlamim, the blood of the shlamim. Hazoreket dam hashlamim. You say the word shlamim, everybody knows what you mean. Hacha mincha gufa mi ikre belula. You never see in the Torah it uses the word belula by itself to mean a mincha. It only says kol mincha belula b'shem iktiv, belula b'shem ikre, belula stam below ikre. We don't call menachot belula. Okay. Last thing we're going to do is say why don't they each hold like each other? So that's basically pointing out the weakness in each approach, and with that we'll finish. Kulu keraba lo amre to adraba machshava de minkra pasa rachmana. They both said it in their explanation. What was wrong with Raba? Raba is counterintuitive. Raba says the more it's wrong, the more we can ignore it. They say the more it's wrong, the more it should be disqualified. So they disagree with the logic of what he's saying. They don't think that the word Zot Torah means, all minchas are the same. What do you mean? The Torah is specified. This mincha is done this way. This mincha is done that way. It's basically like ignoring all of those details. Rav Ashi lo amre mishum kushi de Rava berei de Rava. Because of the difficulty of the belula, we're left with, basically they didn't like his, okay? Even though that one was answered pretty easily, but they explain now why each of them didn't hold by the other. So quick summary of today's stuff. What we basically did was we took these three approaches of resolving the contradiction. We raised difficulties against them. Okay, within Raba, it was basically raising difficulties. If you say it's all about machshava, your maaseha, your actions show that your machshava was a lie, then we bring tons of other cases where that would be true. We answered most of them. In the end, we had to say even Shmuel agrees, and Rabbi Shimon agrees in some of those cases. Okay, then went to Rava and Rav Ashi, and with both of them, we had one main question, which is that's not what Rabbi Shimon said, and then we had to reinterpret that whole thing about Maaseh and what it's doing there. It's actually coming from the opposite. Say, actually looks much worse, but because of some other reason, we're going to permit it. And then we have in each of them one difficulty that we resolved. And with that, we finish for today. Wishing everyone a good day.